Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're welcoming people from the waiting room, so I'll just allow a few moments for people to trickle in and join us. And yeah, I'm really excited about our speaker today and another great offering in our rounds series. So welcome everyone for our McMaster Midwifery Research Center rounds. This is part of our kind of regular ongoing series of rounds open to everyone, where we try to share the latest in midwifery research, obstetrical research, perinatal research, all things that are interesting to us. My name's Beth Murray Davis. I'm the scientific director of the MMRC. While you're with us today, if you can ensure that your Zoom mic is off, your video is off if possible as well, just to minimize distractions. When we are in our Q&A period, you're absolutely welcome to turn your mics and video on so we can have a bit more interaction. Please note that we will be recording this session and then we post them afterwards on our website. And if anybody would like to turn on their closed captioning, feel free to do that as well. Before we dive in, I also want to acknowledge I'm feeling grateful on a stormy and thundery day here in Hamilton to be on the McMaster campus, which is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and the Haudenosaunee nations and lies within the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and is directly adjacent to the Haldimand Territory Treaty. And I think when we offer a land acknowledgement, it's important to be reflective and to be mindful of our actions and to go beyond these words. So I offer this in the spirit of reconciliation. And as a settler here on Turtle Island, I actively commit to reflecting on and fulfilling my treaty responsibilities. I'd like to welcome our speaker for today, Claire Ramlogan-Salanga, who will be presenting on social justice-based curriculum for Ontario midwifery. These are findings from her master's study, and some of us have heard kind of snippets of this before, but it's really great to have you here to tie it together and share with maybe a little bit of a different audience. So we're really excited. I have a bio for Claire that I can read. So Claire is a registered midwife and a lecturer in the Midwifery Education Program. Her leadership positions include Chair of Council at the College of Midwives of Ontario, Chair of the Equity, Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Canadian Midwifery Regulators Council. And as part of her commitment to support the midwifery community, she co-developed the Canadian IBPOC Peer Review Program. And her research interests include health professions education, social justice reform, intersectional approaches to research design and methodology, and health equity. We are delighted that you're here with us, Claire, and the plan is for Claire to present for about 45 minutes or so, leave some time for questions and dialogue at the end. So yeah, enjoy everyone, and thanks again, Claire, for joining us.
Thank you, Beth, for the warm welcome. I'm going to move some things around just so that I can manage the screen. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the land acknowledgement. I wanted to actually give a little bit of a land acknowledgement for where I am today. So today's MMRC rounds are virtual. However, where I am and where you are is on Aboriginal land that has been inhabited by Indigenous peoples from the beginning. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank that all the generations of people who have taken care of this land for thousands of years. Long before today, there have been Aboriginal people who have been the stewards of this place I call home, the town of Rockwood, Eramosa. In particular, I acknowledge the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation of the Anishinaabe people. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaty No. 3 of 1792 and is directly adjacent, as Beth mentioned, to the Haldimand Treaty territory. I recognize and deeply appreciate the historic connection to this place. I also recognize the contributions of the Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples have made both in shaping and strengthening this community, and in particular, our province and country as a whole. As settlers, this recognition of the contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must also be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities, and in particular to bring justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls across our country. Today, I'm going to be discussing the process and results of my study on transforming the Ontario Midwifery Education Program through social justice curriculum, a modified Delphi study. I'd like to say thank you to Dr. Audrey Campbell, Dr. Lawrence Grierson, and Dr. Liz Darling for their supervision, guidance, and support throughout this project. So this presentation will walk you through the research questions and objectives, methods used, as well as some lessons learned. And I hope that this also, those lessons learned, you'll all be able to take in and apply to your context. Some of the results and some next steps. Please note that although this presentation is centered around midwifery curriculum, the process and outcomes are transferable to many health professions curriculum. So my research question asked the simple, tiny little thing of what elements of social justice curriculum should be included in the Ontario Undergraduate Midwifery Education Program. The objectives of the research study were to define social justice in the context of Canadian midwifery, and 2, to identify social justice elements in the context of Canadian midwifery. 3, to develop intended learning outcomes and compare them to the 2020 Canadian midwifery competencies. These were a new set of competencies that came out recently. And 4, to generate some recommendations for the Ontario Midwifery Education Program regarding the integration of social justice curriculum. So I used a modified Delphi study because it's an iterative process that utilizes several rounds of qualitative and quantitative data collection from experts to obtain consensus regarding a topic of interest. My study design involved a literature review and a scan of 5 of the 6 Canadian midwifery education programs. Next, I conducted 3 Delphi rounds. The first involved interviews and focus groups. The second round is where I created the first Delphi survey, where participants were able to prioritize social justice elements on a 7-point Likert scale and also suggest new social justice elements. In round 3, the second and final Delphi was administered. Once the analysis was complete of the qualitative and quantitative data, I shared my results with participants in a member checking session for feedback and confirmation. Moving on to the participants, through purposeful and snowball sampling, I contacted 75 people, and 38 were eventually recruited. This group of experts represented diverse social identities and populations. Attrition varied between 2 and 4 participants per round. Participants were then placed into 2 categories. They were either key informants or subject matter experts. Key informants were either midwifery educators and/or academics, registered midwives, midwifery stakeholders, social workers, and physicians. I intended on including registered nurses, but at this time when this project was going on, I wasn't able to recruit any. I would associate this all with COVID and just an overload of work for nurses at the time. So the subject matter experts included those original group of key informants, but also added senior midwifery students, recent graduates, and recent midwifery consumers. Results from the Delphi Survey 1 built Delphi Survey 2. Positive and negative consensus was set a priori. Social justice elements that obtained positive consensus were removed from the master list. This allowed participants to have a second look at the remaining elements and review the new incoming suggestions from survey number 1. Qualitative data was analyzed using Braun and Clark's thematic analysis framework, and quantitative data was analyzed using descriptive statistics. A member checking session occurred in late April 2022 for the purpose of, again, obtaining rigor. One of the lessons learned along the way was capturing the context of social justice elements was very difficult. Oh, sorry, I went back one too far. Let me go back, if it'll let me go back. No, I can leave it right there. So capturing the context of social justice elements was extremely difficult. This was not a simple process of just listing terms and slotting them into categories for participants to help help me or reorganize or determine if they're important or not. What I learned was that context is everything, and this lesson was taught right from the start with the literature review and scan of the 5 Canadian midwifery education programs. So I know this slide is really busy, but what I really want to show you here is a quick insight as to where these social justice elements came from and how complex it was to organize them. The literature review included 261 studies that were eventually reduced to 24. Once those papers were examined, 68 social justice elements were identified, with the top 13 listed on this slide on the right-hand side. If you notice, these elements at the bottom right are just terms with little to no context. For example, bias was recorded 8 times, but where I made my mistake or lesson learned is that I didn't state how it was being referred to in the article. It took a second review of the elements to get a better understanding on how I was going to create categories and get to a place of thematic analysis. So Braun and Clark, as I mentioned earlier, provide a process for reflective thematic analysis, which in retrospect, I was repeatedly applying throughout my process. They state that there are 6 phases in the process of thematic analysis and that these phases are guidelines which are recursive. Starting with my literature review, I went through the steps of familiarizing myself with the data and creating basic codes, which quickly turned into what I thought were themes. I was jumping ahead too quickly. However, after more review of the context, I had to go back and forth several times with these elements. What I thought were final themes were actually initial categories that represented context. In other words, I thought I was in the light blue section really early in my study, but really what was happening is that I was really moving back and forth between the dark blue and the dark purple section. So generating initial codes and searching for themes. Let me show you this even more. So the scan of the 5 Canadian MEPs, or midwifery education programs, involved 5 English programs, and I was able to extract 48 social justice elements. At that time, I compiled elements from course outlines and syllabi and attempted to place them into categories to provide that context. For example, the term colonialism, white supremacy, and settlers were placed under the category Indigenous health and well-being because that is how the concept was being taught in a few of the course outlines that I received. But I knew that those terms specifically, based on context, had several other possible applications. You'll also note that I placed social justice elements in 5 broad categories or buckets you can think of, and these categories continually to shift to meet the context of the data. Placing these social justice elements in categories for the purpose of context continued to prove to be difficult. As you can see here, there's many steps that I had to go through. The bottom 5 categories remained for the duration of the study, and their only purpose was to provide context to the participants during the focus groups and surveys. And it helped me later on during my final thematic analysis phases suggested by Braun and Clark. So again, each of these rows, as you can see here, were those buckets or categories, and they continue to be reorganized until I landed up with these 5, which is self-awareness, big bucket, systems and institution, another big bucket, the role of midwife and the profession, and Indigenous health and well-being, and theoretical foundations. Let's move on to the results of the Delphi. In round 1, there were 222 social justice elements identified by participants. And by round 3, this number had been reduced to 86. Also in round 3, 32 social justice-based Canadian midwifery competencies were identified from an initial list of 80. So those 86 elements, once thematically analyzed, led to the development of 26 sample learning objectives, which could be used in developing curriculum. Furthermore, from those 26 sample learning objectives, I developed 6 broad program level learning outcomes that were linked to the undergraduate degree level expectations. In other words, upon graduation, a midwifery student should be meeting these program level outcomes. The last phase of the data analysis involved the mapping of the 32 social justice-based Canadian midwifery competencies onto those 26 sample learning objectives. Because remember, the 26 sample learning objectives are reflective of the 86 social justice elements. It's complicated, but I promise I'll show you another version of this that may help clear this up. This linkage, so the last piece here is that this linkage between the objectives and the competencies would aid with connecting these elements in the acute small pieces to the larger national competencies for all midwives. And additionally, this mapping would allow me to see whether or not these elements and competencies would match, or were there any spaces that they did not match, or there was misalignment? So content wasn't there or competencies weren't there. Before I get into anything more, I wanted to just pause for a second and talk about objective 1, which was to define social justice in the context of midwifery education. Part of my Delphi process was to have focus groups with those key informants that I mentioned earlier. The key informants helped me work down the original large group of social justice elements and then narrow them down, narrow and add actually some more social justice elements. One of the questions I had posed to this group is, what are some of the concepts that we would want in a definition of social justice? Out of that process, there were about 20 key social justice elements that were flagged as important in a definition. This definition is what we have landed on, so I'm going to read it for you. Social justice in the context of midwifery education is grounded in the principles of reproductive justice, anti-oppression, and an obligation to the underserved, and professional accountability in both teaching and learning. The process of social justice education includes the critical examination of systems of oppression, such as discrimination domains, privilege and power, colonialism, and white supremacy, coupled with persistent critical self-reflection and reflexivity. This work equips educators and learners to continuously identify root causes of structural and health disparities and incorporate purposeful praxis. A socially just midwifery education curriculum aims to graduate midwives who are committed to mitigating systemic barriers and addressing inequities for birthing people and their support networks within local communities, Canadian healthcare systems, and society at large. Okay, so back to the 86 social justice elements. Again, another very busy slide, but I wanted to share with you the 5 categories, excuse me, the 5 large buckets that we had here, which you can see here. Category 1, self-awareness, and underneath them are listing those 86 social justice elements. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they are here for you to see. Next, I just have a few of the 26 sample learning objectives listed here. And this really addresses objective 3, which was to develop intended learning outcomes and compare them to the 2020 Canadian midwifery competencies. So the next 3 slides kind of cover objective 2. One of the main, or few of these sample learning objectives are explain how colonialism and white supremacy have contributed to health disparities of Indigenous, Black, and racialized people historically and currently in nationally, provincially, and locally. Reflect on ways in which white supremacy, superiority, whiteness impact one's daily practice, so on and so forth. You'll see this all in action as I keep moving forward. Here are those 6 program level learning objectives, which are challenge colonial and white supremacist systems that oppress and contribute to pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and newborn health disparities of Indigenous, Black, racialized, and underserved populations. I'll jump to number 4, advocate for equitable access to and provision of midwifery care at various systems levels. And number 6, integrate anti-oppressive and equity-based theories into praxis. Okay, so I've given you a lot of the pieces, and now I'd like to continue to build them and put them all together. These, again, are the 32 social-based curricula, Canadian midwifery competencies. Our competencies have shifted and align with the roles-based approach that CanMeds has. And so we have 7 areas here, which is primary care provider, advocate, communicator, collaborator, professional, lifelong leader, and leader. So again, my participants went through all 80 and through the Likert sale and consensus building. These were the ones that were highlighted as reflecting social justice-based ideals and competencies that they would like to flag as social justice-based. So those are here too. You'll see the codes also are lined up on the side. So A1 all the way down to lead 8. Okay, so I keep talking about this idea of thematic analysis. I popped it up in the corner and said earlier that I was living in purple and dark blue. And where I am now with the results is landing up with going through this cycle all the way out to the pinkish area. So making my way back around. So there were 3 main themes that emerged. There were the primary systems of oppression, secondary systems of oppression, and systems of action and praxis. Under each theme, I began to notice several subthemes. Interestingly, there were 2 subthemes, legal and economic structure, and policy and health service structure, the green boxes, where none of the identified social justice elements had a corresponding social justice-based competency, so a misalignment. The gap revealed that either the participants did not recognize these themes as social justice-based concepts, or the new Canadian midwifery competencies did not include competencies that required structural awareness. This paradigm has been exemplified by Metzl and Hansen's theory of structural competency, which I'm about to get into in a few slides. So this is it kind of put together, and I'm giving you a couple of samples that you can look at. When we go through the slide, we'll be moving from left to right, bottom to top. As you just saw, of the first row of the analysis indicated that the primary structures of oppression, which can be seen on the left, so the left part here. So this is the first large theme. The sub-theme here is colonialism and white supremacy, again on the left. At the bottom of this table are the social justice elements that were placed into categories for the purpose of context, so that idea of buckets. And you can see the buckets there. Category 1, self-awareness. Category 2, the profession and the role of the midwife. Number 3, systems and institutions. And number 4, Indigenous health and well-being. This broad term was identified in both categories. So this let me go back one step. You'll see that in each category, the social justice elements are listed, the ones that were identified. You can see them here. There they are. And as we move further up this slide, you'll see the Canadian midwifery competencies that actually align with those social justice elements. They also align with the sample learning objectives that were created. And then at the top of this slide, you'll see the program level learning outcomes. So this program level learning outcome should cover all of this context that we have here. I repeated this process through all 86 social justice elements, 32 competencies, and the 6 program level learning outcomes. So here's another example about the secondary structures of oppression. And you can see here that I've picked one of them, which is power structures, as an example of a subcategory. The social justice elements that were identified primarily fell into the self-awareness category. And all of these Canadian midwifery competencies, learning objectives, and program level outcomes are stacked upon each other as ways to capture that information. One thing that is important to see here is these green boxes. These align with that original slide I showed you where there was a gap where legal and economic structures were this here, legal and economic subcategory. There were no Canadian midwifery competencies that were identified that matched up with legal and economic structures. And even if of those social justice elements, only a few were identified by participants as being important or should be included in our curriculum. So this was a bit of a flag. This was a flag for me. And the same thing happened again with policy and health services structures. Again, no identified competencies and only a few pieces here that were social justice elements that had been identified. This got me thinking. So, in brief, structural competency is a concept that was coined by Metzel and Hansen, which describes a need for healthcare providers to recognize that there are structural forces that occur upstream that influence the health and well-being of the client or the patient downstream. Those upstream forces include things such as race, low income, lack of access to healthcare facilities, food insecurity, geography, etc. And as a result of these upstream influences, healthcare providers may need to reconsider what contributes to illness and how we define illness itself. This theoretical framework was starting to put together the pieces of why those gaps were there. Were we not looking at the structural structure as part of our social justice curriculum? That was another big question in my head. So here, this figure represents, it's thinking about itself, I think, represents the concept of structural competency. Upstream, there are structures such as policies, economic systems, and social hierarchies that influence the forces that I mentioned previously that are the social determinants of health, and those factors end up affecting health outcomes downstream. We see these poor health outcomes in our clinic spaces and in our classrooms. My addition to this theory is that pink oval that was kind of sitting there for a moment. And the part that I would guess we would not really paying attention to or focusing on because it's in the background, it's just there, it's sort of inconspicuous. This pink section represents the primary structures of oppression, specifically colonialism and white supremacy. Metzel and Hansen did recognize the need for structural competency. However, they did not extend their definition to include what I call the rule book. This systems rule book has shaped and constructed all other secondary structures of oppression, be it those policies, economic systems, and social hierarchies. As learners, educators, and healthcare providers, we need to understand that this ubiquitous force, that primary structure of oppression, is always present. It is our job as learners and educators and healthcare providers to be aware of how these structures affect us through practicing self-awareness, through examining our profession and our roles as midwives and doctors and nurses and whoever else is joining us today, through critically examining the systems and institutions we live, learn, and work in, as well as understanding and investigating the poor health experiences and outcomes of marginalized populations. The last adaptation that I've added to this figure is the arrow that lives half in the oval and half on the outside. This arrow represents anti-oppressive praxis, meaning that our social justice awareness needs to go beyond awareness and rhetoric. Instead, it needs to become an active disruption. This is the only way that the systems rulebook will ever change or be challenged. Structural competency is from this project. I tried to redefine structural competencies with some of the learnings that happened from this project. So structural competency is the trained ability to acknowledge, recognize, and challenge the root causes of health inequities using a structural approach. Healthcare providers must accept that the goal of the primary structures of oppression, which are white supremacy and colonialism, is to dominate and subjugate Indigenous, Black, racialized, and marginalized populations. This goal is codified within the secondary structures of oppression, which are social, economic, and political systems of all global societies. In healthcare, codified oppression can be found in both overt and covert ways. For example, diagnostic lab results, body mass index, diagnosis of disease, intergenerational trauma, labeling of at risk. As a result, the health and well-being of people of the global majority are negatively affected throughout the life cycle, resulting in intergenerationally poor health outcomes. Therefore, the ill remain ill and powerless, while the healthy remain healthy and powerful. Healthcare providers must utilize the structures and the structure of action and praxis, which is population health, Indigenous and Black health and well-being, trauma-informed care, and respectful care, to actively recognize and challenge all primary and secondary structures of oppression, to improve client outcomes and ultimately construct an equitable healthcare system and society. So, with all that learning, I want to move us to next steps. In the Midwifery Education Program, we have had some time to digest a lot of this work and are thinking about ways to move forward into incorporating this social justice curriculum into all levels of the program. This again is in a working, it's a work in progress. And so what I have here are some proposed steps and some things to think about and take-home messages for your own programs. So I propose a three-prong approach that centers social justice-based health professions education. There is work that needs to be done with faculty, preceptors, and the curriculum itself. I do not propose that this is the end of the end of it all, and how we curate social justice in healthcare education programs. Issues such as policy, practice, interprofessional collaboration, and overall cultural shift in approaches to healthcare are all part of this movement, and they should be addressed in conjunction with curriculum reforms. So here, there's lots going on here, but really what I want to focus on is letting you all know about some of the things that we are thinking about doing, some of the things we are doing, and some of the things that maybe you can take home again and apply in your own programs. So for training and professional development, we are working on fostering cultural shift in the Ontario Midwifery Education Program. We have book and journal studies going on monthly that talk about topics, big, huge topics, small topics, and we try and apply them back to the work that we do. We create reading lists, we talk about conferences, and we schedule training sessions for faculty and staff, things such as crucial conversation, some teaching skills programs, and SANYAS courses, and so on and so forth. We know that training and professional development is one part of the actual learning, but the doing is the other big part. Another section of work here is curriculum mapping. So the Ontario Midwifery Education Program in general is doing a review of their curriculum. We're suggesting that the use of an equity review tool for courses to audit each course be used. I'll get into that in a little bit in a second. And then to map social justice education to existing courses, use constructive alignment, which I didn't get into this presentation, but I'll touch on it in a few slides. To structure courses, consider alternative teaching and learning activities, and consider alternate assessments and evaluations or combinations of them. For our preceptors, which is pretty much half of our course, half of our program, I should say, there needs to be an ongoing training sessions provided to our preceptors, and we currently do run at least one program for an anti-racist, anti-oppressive ways of teaching and providing and giving feedback. We also need to provide resources for preceptors to practice with working through challenging conversations and situations that occur within the hospital setting, within the clinic space, with clients. We also need some QI, quality improvement initiatives for preceptors, and involve clients in the evaluation of preceptors, which I know is a touchy topic going back and forth, but we also need to make this transparent and a holistic approach of being better as preceptors. Finally, there needs to be program evaluations. So planning and mapping program course evaluations. Ask who will take part in this review. I think that's a big ask. Again, going back to the idea of transparency and a holistic approach. Is it students? Is it faculty, sessional instructor, midwives, preceptors, consumers? All of these people should have some form of input in the work that we do. And then setting up some type of review of course content every, I put 5 years, but it's just X amount of years of continually updating the content. So for curriculum mapping, I have here in the top corner the concept of constructive alignment, where you are creating intended learning outcomes, you would create teaching and learning activities, and assessment and evaluation. It is a triangle of work that we do for health professions education. And when creating a course or reviewing a course, we want to make sure that what we think we want the student to learn at the end of the class is where we actually begin the work. So where students land up, which is those intended learning outcomes, and then we build the course backwards, saying, okay, if that's where we want students to learn, how do we do this in a fashion that meets the needs of the students, gets the curriculum across, meets competencies, and so on and so forth. So this is part of that review of current curriculum. I've put a link here of the Equity and Midwifery Education Toolkit, an audit for course syllabi. We can pop that in the chat for those that are not familiar with this website. It has a lot of great tools, and I highly recommend that other programs use this for a starting place. Then we want to map our social justice elements into our existing course. One of the pieces, we can bump into, or the place that we can default to, is that there's no more room. Like, we teach everything on the planet, and like, how can we add more to our existing curriculum? And this isn't necessarily about adding more, it's about integrating it into what we already have. As we know, social justice concepts and content is everywhere. It is part of that diagram I showed you. It's integrated into our lives and into our space. So there's always room for this. It's talking about making sure that topics don't get erased or shoved to the side and not acknowledged. So there is always room. The last point here is consider alternative teaching and learning activities and assessment and evaluation methods. Only a few more slides, I promise. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but step one, review that current curriculum. Again, I have what this audit process would look like. We need to know what we have before we can make any changes to what we want. So to really look at what's old curriculum, what's old reading, what's old process that should be removed and potentially updated into newer content, relevant content, and content that is not white-centered. I'm going to move forward. So step two, mapping the curriculum. This is the hardest piece. I think the most tedious piece. Will be taking our 86 social justice elements and figuring out, where do they belong and how do you scaffold this curriculum throughout all 4 levels of the program. I suggested using Bloom's taxonomy to help develop those learning levels of learning and guide the development of intended learning outcomes, so that you can know that maybe in year 1, you're introducing the concept of colonialism and white supremacy as a big, broad concept. But then in level 2, you're talking about how does it show up in the system? How does it show up in the antenatal form that you use, that you fill out every single day, and in the way you ask questions? Level 3 could be part of pathology, and et cetera, et cetera. And consider revisiting that audit process to ensure that supporting materials are inclusive and, as I said before, not white-centered. Steps 3, 4, and 5, we haven't got to this place yet, but what we're working on is considering those alternative teaching and learning activities and assessments and evaluation methods. And then obviously, of course, always we need to evaluate and redesign for quality improvement and continuous improvement. That's all, folks. I think I did it, Rash and Beth, to get us in on time. I hope you all enjoyed this, and I'm really open to any questions.
Thank you, Claire. That was amazing. I know you have so much data and you have so much in this project that I know it's hard to kind of package the version that you share, but I think this gave us a really great snapshot of what you've been working on. And yeah, your organization of those tables and stuff is like next level. The colors and the left and the right and the up and the down, very impressive. So we do have time for questions, which is great because I think people are really interested. I also want to mention that we will pop up a poll in a moment for just feedback for us about the rounds. The poll will stay up for a couple minutes. I think it's there right now. So please don't disregard it. Take a moment to fill it out while we get organized for questions, and give us some feedback about how you've been enjoying or not these rounds, and any comments for us to improve them in the future. So I did see a hand go up. I think it was Lisa Morgan. Did you have a question, Lisa, that you want to ask? Feel free to pop your video on, all of those things.
The red was my camera slid. So yeah, I'm hearing about structural competency, immediately I'm thinking critical race theory. Right, we're looking at systems and how racism is built into systems. I saw you go, So that was my question: how structural competency and critical race theory connect or don't, or what comments you might have about that.
So they could connect. It's a good question, and I only did this because I've never thought of it that way in this context. So in this context, I was looking at structural competency as a way that we view, when I say we, healthcare providers view the systems that surround us. So with Metzl and Hansen's piece, the idea was that the structures that exist, the racism and oppression exists in those structures. There was no kind of figuring out like, well, why is it just there? It didn't just appear. It's there because it's been codified sort of in a larger scale. And so when you think about CRT and thinking like, yes, there could be a connection because we're talking about the codification of oppression in law and how these multiple oppressions occur in all structures. So yes, there could be this connection in these two pieces of how they link. In this study in particular, I didn't go to that direction, but actually, interestingly enough, in those 5 big buckets, one of the buckets was theoretical frameworks, and so critical race theory is there. Obviously, some other theories are there: anti-oppressive praxis, disability justice, et cetera, et cetera. So they're all there. They all work together in multiple ways to look at the same large systemic oppressions that do occur. I just didn't think about crisscrossing those two together. Oh, you're on mute, Matt.
I'm on mute. Thanks, Lisa. There's a question in the chat as well from Tracy Murphy. So she wants to know what your recommendation is to the CMRC when it's time for them to revise their Canadian competency for midwives. Hi, Tracy. I don't know if you want to chime in about that.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thanks for the question, Tracy. And this is where my study kind of paused. Maybe I take it into my next career and lifetime of more projects to ask. Actually, that real question is, was it that the group of participants didn't recognize or haven't been taught or don't see structures as part of social justice work? Right? The dismantling of social justice work, is that the issue? Or is there a gap in the competencies themselves that don't articulate the role that systems play in social justice awareness or social justice work? So these are the two places where I was kind of left with this gap of thinking, what was it? Or is it a combination of? And which brings us now back to education. Is it because the MEP in our curriculum, we don't focus on recognizing how systems interact and have an effect on client care and client wellness. So I don't have a full great answer for you, Tracy, but I think this is like part 2, part 3.
No, I appreciate that, Claire. And I've taken a lot of notes. I need to think about it too. And maybe we can circle back.
Yes, for sure.
Okay. Thank you.
For sure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy.
Thanks, Tracy. Other questions for Claire?
And I know it was a lot of content. There's even more if I really were to slow this down and to like blow this all up. But yeah, that was a snapshot.
Yeah, it was great. I know people may not know that you are the instructor at MAC for the social justice course, and that there's a new course in the master's program about social justice as well. Can you comment on how this, like your learning from this, has informed both of those courses? Like give us some really practical examples of how you're thinking differently about the courses you teach.
It's interesting because you know, students, when they come into either the undergrad or the grad program, there is a desire to really dig deep into social justice, like the big term social justice. I think one of the hard parts about this is when we start to walk into the conversation, there comes a point where we realize this is much bigger than a 12-week course, or in the undergraduate, a 26-week course. So taking bite-sized pieces, the importance of actually creating a scaffold of learning, or a step-by-step increased level of awareness, increased level of digging into the content, really has to be purposeful and thoughtful. Because you can't really, I don't see us jumping from like 0 to 100 in one course. Another aspect of this that I'm starting to shift the curriculum slowly is the idea of understanding how structures do play into social justice. Like there's this place where I think we people from North America, those educated in this system, we take for granted the systems that exist and the rules that apply and the rules that are there, without actually critically examining why are those rules there? Is that really a policy, or is that just repeated behavior over and over and over? And so it turns into this policy. So breaking this down and just having students be aware of that and being intentional in their movement and in their thinking. And, you know, in our master's course, it's challenging to really get us to think about, as midwifery leaders, am I looking at everything? Am I looking, when I say everything, am I looking with a different lens other than just what's the problem in front of me? Because there's other steps behind. So I know some folks here I could see that are from our program could probably speak to hearing me repeat this about 1,000 times, but really thinking about, are we capturing the voice of the people who don't have a voice, the users of our services? Are we actually understanding what they need? They are part of the structure in the system. So anyway, I could ramble on about this for a long time, but I think those are part of the pieces we have to incorporate in the program at different levels of the education process. I see there's a lot going on over here in the chat.
Laura asked about the video, so we were just posting information about that. And then a new question from Michelle. She says, I wonder if you could speak about the ways in which university-based midwifery educators and programs might be reflective and action-oriented, and how we reconsider our own structures, or how our own structures are upholding racism, colonialism, cis heteronormativity, ableism. Example, the concept of discrete competencies, university structures as colonizing institutions. A small question, again, similar to your small presentation. Thanks, Michelle. That's a great one.
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of like a bite-size answer to. So like I just said, there's, 0 to 100. There's no way to do a gigantic leap like that. Where I think, just like in our classroom space, and I've been learning as I've been, learning myself going into teaching these courses and through this project, there truly are small steps that need to happen. And if we're talking about a midwifery program or universities, the institution itself, you need to actually move everyone sort of at the same time and move, or at least have a large group of people moving with the same kind of thinking forward. That in itself is like a cultural shift. If you don't have this support of an overall cultural shift or want to do this, doing the work seems impossible. It feels impossible. It's like an uphill battle pushing that boulder up the mountain. I think the piece of getting everybody on the same page and talking about this in small pieces, digestible pieces, and to then see a little bit of success is what gets the ball rolling. And when everybody starts to feel that motion and evolution, it's almost like a rebirth of the program and a rebirth of like what could be possible. And those are the things that I think will help move us forward, be it the program, the university, the profession. I know it sounds kind of hokey, but truly I do feel like if we don't get everyone sort of moving on the same page, it's just going to be very, very difficult. I don't even know if that answered your question. I hope it did.
She says thank you and smiley face. I think, as someone who has been with, in that journey here at McMaster of the cultural shift, I think it is, it's about raising that awareness. And like you say, there is momentum to it. And so I think it starts and then it builds. And, now I find in our gatherings, we are thinking about it more. We're naming it. We're thinking about where else do we need to, take this lens and this approach. And so, it's admissions, right? You start to see the all-encompassing places in which we need to be reflective and taking action related to this. So I think it is that process of cultural change, which we all know is not easy, not fast, and does require that buy-in from, folks kind of throughout the group, right?
I also think, and Beth, you can engage me with this conversation, is the other piece of we make mistakes. Like humans, we make mistakes. We forget something, we try something, we forgot this, and it's like, oh gosh, I forgot. Okay, we're going to make a change for the next round. And so providing a little space and grace for initiatives that have good intentions and work forward and are trying to make a shift. It's okay. This back and forth is what's needed. Like, as you mentioned in admissions, like, it's a process. It's just constantly evolving process. Even the curriculum will be a constantly evolving piece. Social justice concepts change all the time. If I even were to go back to those 86, I bet you we could blow that up even bigger now and have even more concepts and terms. So that was a snapshot of really 2021, 22. And soon it could be outdated, but you want these big concepts to be taken forward into your curriculum that would never change. Or never really shift too much, real deep concepts. So anyway, yeah, there's just a lot to do with it, but it can be done. I truly do believe it can be done.
That's great. Other questions for Claire? We did put the link in the chat for the equity tool that you were mentioning. Any other kind of take-home tools or resources that you want to mention to folks? I think that's useful from that curriculum perspective. What about the preceptor on the ground? Is there anything in that equity toolkit on that website or something else that they can use to prompt their own reflection?
There is so much on that website. So that website, which I will try and pop in there in a second. I think it's equity.
It's equitymidwifery.org planning evaluation. Yeah, we have it in the chat.
Thank you. So if you snoop around in that website, it's endless. There's readings, there's toolkits, there's audit forms, there's curriculum design, there are preceptor like feedback tools. There's so much there that it's a hidden gem, to be honest. I don't think we use it as much as we could use it for ideas. It is based out of the States, but even the workshops they hold are really useful. So I think that if people have time, like, please check it out and pull pieces from there. I don't have off the top of my head something that they could use, but I do know there's a ton of resources. I would even say it's not just applicable to MEPs. I think stakeholders, midwifery stakeholders, could get a lot from that website as well for their own initiatives for associations, colleges, regulators, etc. Yeah,
That's great. Yeah, so that's our homework, is to go and spend some time there and keep reflecting on what you've shared with us today.
yeah.
This has been great. Any final questions for Claire before we wrap up? Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And we have actually our last rounds in the series is coming up May 31st. And so it's the same Zoom link you used today, but you can see the title and date and everything there. It's Lucidra McKecker, who will be presenting community engagement and anti-racist approaches to pregnancy health knowledge exchange with racialized newcomers in Canada and Denmark. So that's a really interesting talk. And Lucidra was here at MAC and now is based in Denmark. So it's a nice kind of combination of her work. Also, a plug for our research symposium is coming up as well. So we run it on Zoom over the lunch kind of window, if you will, from 12 to 1:30 daily, the week of May 8th to May 12th. And thank you, Rash, for hosting the save the date. You do have to register for this event, and it'll be kind of a Zoom webinar format. So on our website, you can find this information, and we'll pop this Zoom webinar detail into the chat. And we hope we see you there. And so please mark your calendars for both of those. And yeah, stay tuned to our website, mmrc.mcmaster.ca, and you can find this recording. Give us a little bit of time to kind of polish it up and put it up on the website. But all of our rounds from this year have been posted there. So a good place to keep checking back. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. And hopefully we'll see you in May for our next events.